So just let me say again, as joint holders of the Hamid bin Khalifa Endowed Chair of Islamic Art at Virginia Commonwealth University, Jonathan and I are thrilled to welcome you here to the 4th Biennial Hamid bin Khalifa Symposium on Islamic Art. We'd like to again extend our thanks to the Qatar Museum Authority, VCU Qatar, the Qatar Foundation, and especially the Museum of Islamic Art and Aisha Al-Khatir, who have been so generous in funding this and putting together this symposium. We also again would like to extend our thanks to the dedicated staff who have really been working hard to put this all together. As many of you probably know, these symposia address broad aspects of Islamic art, and we try to make the latest research available to the widest possible audience. We also pick our themes specifically for the time and place. The first symposium that Jonathan and I convened was held 4 years ago, right here in Doha. It addressed the theme of water in Islamic art and culture, a subject that's, of course, of increasing importance in this part of a very arid region. The papers were beautifully published by Yale University Press in this volume entitled Rivers of Paradise, And they came out 2 years later in time for the 2009 symposium that we held in Córdoba, Spain. It addressed the subject of color in Islamic art, and those papers have also been prepared by Yale University Press in an even more handsome volume. They are just being published. They will be widely available soon. And we have arranged for you outside, just behind the place where you registered, there is a book display of books written by many of the speakers here, including copies of Rivers of Paradise, and also Diverse Are Their Hues. Is there a way we can reformat the presentation? They are not for sale. They are to look at. There is a list with all the publishers, so you can go home and you can find them from your local book distributor or Amazon or whatever you'd like to do, but you can actually see them here. So the book display will open with the coffee break in the morning and will go until tomorrow at lunchtime. So if you want to go and take a look at books, they're all out there. Now, the theme of color was particularly resonant in Córdoba, given the nature of the mosque there, with its beautiful multicolored arches, its spectacular mihrab and maksura. And similarly, we have picked what we hope is an appropriate topic here for this, our third symposium that we've organized, the art of the object. Topical, particularly because of the superb collection assembled here in the Museum of Islamic Art. Many of you in the scholarly community may know that within the last generation, the object has become a topic of increasing importance. This began with Arjun Appadurai's groundbreaking work that appeared in 1986 called The Social Life of Things, Commodities in Cultural Perspective. It was a publication of a group of conference papers by 5 anthropologists, a social historian, and an archaeologist. It focused on the relationship between people and things, how people define themselves with reference to things, and how cultural meanings of things are constituted by their exchange or their withdrawal from exchange. Most of the essays were heavily theoretical, following on the terms coined in the introduction by the anthropologist Ihor Kapitov about an object's cultural biography, or using the terms preferred by anthropologists, an object's life history. Oddly enough, in this volume, Appadurai did not include the work of art historians, although particularly in the field of Islamic art, the object has been a subject of increasing importance, or a subject of importance for generations. Take, for example, these silk panels. They are first and foremost a functional object, not a decorative or applied one. They are the linings of a tent. And in the galleries upstairs, we can see many other examples where similar objects have been transformed in the hands of master craftsmen into sublime works of art. In the broader field of art history, the study of the object has become even more topical. And to take but one very popular example, in the first half of 2010, Neil MacGregor, the director of the British Museum, offered a program on BBC Radio called The History of the World in 100 Objects. These were pithy 15-minute presentations on objects drawn from the British Museum collections, and you can download them as podcasts. They too were published in a volume that came out in October of last year. So our symposium here combines features of many of these projects. Like Apodorai's volume, we begin as a series of papers that will eventually be published, I have to say, with glorious pictures, unlike his volume. Like Neil MacGregor's volume, or like Neil MacGregor, we focus on objects in a single museum. In his case, the British Museum, here the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha. Again, they chronicle history. He had the history of the world. We're a little bit more modest. We only do the history of the Islamic world. And again, like MacGregor, we've chosen our topics deliberately. The careful viewer will notice that our objects span the history of Islamic art, from its beginnings in the 7th and 8th century under the Umayyads until the age of the great empires in the 17th and 18th century. Lest anyone, of course, think that Islam died in the 18th century, we began last night specifically and deliberately with the wonderful talk on the museum itself as an object for objects. Paul Goldberg's keynote address then set I.M. Pei's museum as an object in a place to hold the collection. In many ways, one must reflect that I.M. Pei's brief was not so different from that faced by the designers of the Dome of the Rock or the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, who had to use the materials and techniques of late antiquity to meet the architectural needs of a new culture. Similarly, in addition to chronology, we selected our speakers to address the various media that are so prominent in Islamic art. 3 papers treat the arts of fire, Aimee Frome on ceramics, and I must tell you that Aimee has had a family emergency and she is not able to join us today, but her paper will be included in the published volume. We also have Aimee Frome on metalware and Rachel Ward on glass. And Rachel, unfortunately, has just had to have an emergency operation. She's fine, but she will not be able to join us, and her paper will be read by Jonathan Bloom. 2 other speakers address aspects of textiles. In economic terms, arguably the most important art within the Islamic tradition. We have Kel van Valsack on the art of silks, and Michael Francis on carpets. 4 speakers deal with the arts of the book, which played such a seminal role in the creation and dissemination of Islamic culture. Francois Deroche on early Quran manuscripts, Mohammed Zakaria on calligraphy, Emily Savage Smith on a Sufi's Guide to the Constellations, and John Seiler on pages from the spectacular album Made for Jahangir. Eleanor Sims will take up the related topic of figural representation in oil painting and its relation with the traditional book arts. And once again in our papers, we do not want to slight architecture, which created the physical setting in which many of these objects were seen and understood. So in addition to Goldberger's keynote address, we have Julia Ganella discussing stuccos from the 9th century palaces at Samarra in Iraq, and Antonio Vallejo Triano on the marble capitals from the 10th century palace at Medinat Zahra near Cordova in Spain. In all cases, we have asked the speakers to select an object or a group of objects in the museum and then develop that subject in any way that they feel works best. They will, we hope, lead to a discussion of many relevant topics: the interaction between Islam and neighboring countries, in the East and the West, questions of the collecting and display of objects, the problems of faking and forgery, and many, many more subjects which I can only imagine and I hope to enumerate at the end. The speakers will also address their subjects from many different perspectives, because we have invited not only art historians, but also historians of science, curators, and archaeologists. And thus we hope we will look at these objects not just as MacGregor did, as signals from the past, his term, but as objects that continue to have resonance today and speak to us with myriad voices. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first introducer, who will then introduce the speakers and their objects, who will speak to us with many voices. So please join me here in welcoming Samira Abbas, who's going to be give us our first introduction.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me take this opportunity to welcome you all to the 4th Biennial Hamad bin Khalifa Symposium. My name is Samira Abbas, and I'm a sophomore at Virginia Commonwealth University in Qatar. I'm very honored today to have the privilege of welcoming an academic dean in l'École pratique des hautes études. He is a specialist in the studies of ancient Quranic manuscripts, and he is among the people who reviewed the catalog of the Quran. Among his research are the various aspects of the handwriting book in the Islamic world, with a special interest in the early period. His books include the Islamic Catalog, an introduction to the study of manuscript in Arabic scripts, the Abbasid tradition, and Le Manuscrit du Quran, among others. Today, he is going to speak to us about of volumes and skeins. Please ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Francois Deroche.
Of this conference, for inviting me to speak about pages which will turn into a volume, because to speak of isolated pages would be purposeless. So I will try to reconstruct with you the original appearance and the meaning of a manuscript, part of which is here in this collection, manuscript 248. And, well, my title may be a little bit strange, but you will see that there are some reasons why we will go from skins to volume. In the aftermath of the Russian conquest of Turkestan, the general governor of the newly conquered province, General Konstantin von Kaufmann, sent in October 1869 to the Imperial Library in St. Petersburg a large copy of the Quran, which was acquired from local ulemas in Samarkand. In spite of the soothing report the latter wrote for the Russian authorities about the worthlessness of this manuscript, one suspects that they did not part light-heartedly with it. Until that moment, it had been kept in the Khwaja mosque in that city. According to a local tradition, this manuscript was a copy of the Holy Book, which the Caliph Osman was reading when he was murdered, and the pages were stained with his blood. It was in Istanbul, so it said, in possession of the Caliph of Rome, who either presented it to Khwaja Arrar, a local holy man of Samarkand, or had to give it up as a reward to a disciple of the Khwaja. Another local informant, however, linked this manuscript with Timur, who had it brought to Samarkand. The quite outstanding copy of the Quran, with folios measuring 53 by 68 centimeters, written with 12 lines to the page, could naturally elicit this kind of tales. It remained in St. Petersburg Library until 1917, when the Soviet authorities decided to hand it back to the Central Asian Muslim community, and it is now kept in Tashkent. I shall refer to it as the Tashkent copy. While the manuscript was in St. Petersburg, it was examined at the latest in 1890 by a Russian scholar, Andrei Shebunin, who published in 1891 a documented study of this copy, which led him to date it to the 2nd century of the Hijra, 8th century, and to conclude that it was deriving from the Basra Codex. A few years later, a facsimile was made and published by Sergei Pisarev in 1905. The manuscript was no longer complete when it was analyzed by Shebunin. It contained then 353 folios, 69 of which were paper replacements. In addition, many parchment folios had been provided with new paper margins. The text stopped at Surah 43, verse 11, and was, before that point, interrupted by many lacunae. There are conflicting reports about the number of folios which are now kept in Tashkent. According to a report made for the UNESCO, there are about 250 folios, while Tayyar al-Tukulach speaks of 338. Some folios have therefore been taken away after Shebunin saw the manuscript. However, before 1890, or perhaps even before that time, some folios were no longer with the Tashkent manuscript. It is the case of the folios which will be discussed here. 20 folios, actually manuscript 248 and manuscript 658, containing portions of text from Surah 21 to 23 and corresponding to a lacuna in the Tashkent Codex between folio 286 and 287. Some folios, either stolen from the Tashkent Codex or taken from the manuscript at an earlier date, appeared during the last 20 years on the art market. In 1992, an auction house had a C14 analysis of the parchment performed on a sample taken from one folio. It determined a 68% possibility for a date between 640 and 765, and a 95% possibility for a date between 595, which of course is a little bit strange, and 8055. The folios now in the collection of the Museum of Islamic Art cannot be properly discussed here without taking into consideration the whole manuscript. It will be therefore necessary to examine some technical aspects before trying to replace the copy into its original context. The Doha folios originate from the same part of the manuscript and contain the following portions of text. You see that three folios in white, which are in other places, are also part of the same, let's say, same place from the manuscript. The longest sequence, that is to say, the longest sequence of folio continuous, does not exceed 5 folios. So we don't have a complete range of text continuous on, let's say, 20 folios. It's interrupted many times by losses. The text is written on a rather thick parchment. Its hair side does not keep any traces of the edges of the skin, which suggests that a fair portion of the sheets had been eliminated during the trimming process in order to get the nicest appearance. On the flesh side, some traces of the production process survive on many folios, mainly in the corners on the right-hand side, close to the back of the volume. It's the marks in the upper part of my slide. The uncommon size of the book could only be obtained by using a leaf of parchment for each folio, thus avoiding the usual process of folding, which is the basis of the codex. In other words, this copy is an in plano. In his paper, Chebunin already noted, on the basis of his own examination that the parchment folios had been stacked one above the other in the same position, with the flesh side being the recto of every single folio from beginning to end. Unless a mistake occurred during the production of the copy, which is the case for Chebunin's folio 3, 4, 11, 12, 236, 239, and 309, every time the manuscript was opened, the reader would see a right page with the hair side and a left page with the flesh side, the former slightly yellowish and with the script quite legible, and the latter of a whiter appearance with the script fading away. The contrast is certainly more striking today than it was at the time the manuscript was produced. One has to note that it would have been technically very easy to alternate the position of the sheets in order to get openings of the same nature, that is to say, hair facing hair and flesh facing flesh. So it was a decision to do this. One of the features of the Tashkent manuscript, according to Chebunin's description, are the stains, which were supposed to be the caliph's own blood. As the Russian scholar observed, the blood had been poured intentionally on the inner part of the folios, whence it spread more or less towards their center. This has been done every 2 openings, so that stains are found, for example, on folio 33 verso and 34 recto, as well as 35 verso and 36 recto, but there is no blood on the 2 folios, 2 sides between. So it was a rather strange way of dying. Another feature of the Tashkent manuscript in 1890 was its state of disorder and the traces of many attempts at restoring it. In his paper, Chebunin describes a copy made with quires of 8 or 10 folios paired by their stubs. Typically, in a 10-folio quire, folio 1 and 10 would be joined, then 2 with 9, and so on, in order to constitute bifolia, with a crease where the binder could sew them together. That the Tashkent volume is constituted of quires seems to receive a confirmation from the fact that the recently stolen folios have a very narrow inner margin and no stub nor line of prickings, because they were probably cut close to the back. The robber did not care to cut the stitch in order to take it away. The Doha folios exhibit a few original features which will be mentioned here. As noted previously, no sequence of folios exceeds 5. Therefore, it's not possible to reconstruct safely the way in which they were kept together. On the other hand, 4 groups of folios are sufficiently close as to allow a few remarks. A first one has to do with the general appearance of the folios. They are flat and show no sign of a crease on the left-hand side of the rectos. Secondly, there is a line of prickings running parallel to the edge of the folio between the edge itself and a thick brownish smear. The observation of the lines of prickings found on the stubs show that the same pattern is repeated on all folios, which means that about as much as 18 folios, 14 actually present and presumably 4 missing, were pierced together, presumably with a thin blade. On all folios which could be observed, the holes are oriented in the same way, at a slight angle with the axis. They clearly do not correspond to the stitching of a quire, as it is done usually. They are very close from each other and too numerous indeed to have been used for classical sewing. And they are not rectilinear, as one would expect if they had been done in the central fold of a bifolio. Thirdly, in addition to the main line of prickings, other holes can be seen between the latter and the edge of the skin. One of them in the upper part of the folio having, and it's my circle, my red, no, it's not a circle, my ellipse here. There is some pricking having the Greek P letter shape, if you can see that on the photographs. They are rather regularly spaced between 8 and 9 centimeters because there are others on the side, and, well, may correspond to technical preparation of the folios. And a last point, of course, as you noticed on my first slide, there is no blood stain on any folio. Is the condition of the Doha folios compatible with Shebunin's account? We have here two different situations. The Tashkent manuscript was constructed, or better reconstructed, according to the customary codex technique, first by folding the parchment folios in order to produce a stub on the back side, then by pairing two isolated folios at a time in order to reconstruct a bifolio, and finally by sewing together 8 or 10 such bifolios in order to get quires which could be bound easily. Does it correspond to the original situation? The Doha folios provide the beginning of an answer. The fact that they exhibit neither traces of a crease nor those of stitching suggests that they were separated from those that are nowadays in Tashkent before the latter were bound according to the configuration described by Shebunin, and retained for this reason what could be, I say could be, their original appearance or very close to it. Did this happen while the manuscript was already in Central Asia or in the place where it was previously kept until Timur took it away, if we accept the local tradition I mentioned previously? I've been unable to find clues which would help us in figuring the history of this copy. However, as we shall see, even in the second case, that is to say, if the folios, the Doha folios were separated from the rest, it may have already been known as a Codex of Usman. Of course, one could speculate that the 18 Doha folios, at least, were all in one of the halves of a quire. They have the same pricking, so one could imagine that they are part of a quire. That they were paired, and it's my drawing here, they were paired with folios of originally slightly larger dimensions in width in order to have a stub on which they would have been sewn. It's my drawing. So you would have two asymmetrical folios paired together and then bound, of course, normally. But such a situation would have been, to a large extent, similar to the Tashkent volume, although the number of folios per quire should have been 36 instead of 8 or 10, which seems difficult. The more so that with the line of, with the stitching on the side, it would have increased the size of the back of the codex, and it would have looked like this. So I don't think this would work in this way. How can we explain the prickings? The manuscript, as I said, is an in plano, in other words, a book where every single folio is a sheet of parchment. Technically, it's not a codex, I repeat it, although it may look like one. The Doha folios only give us a part of the picture. The pricking was probably a preparation for the sewing, which required the thread to go through the folios to help hold them together. Are the additional holes part of the same operation, or do they correspond to a later restoration? It is difficult to decide. Another point remains unclear, where the folios, grouped at least by 18, which is enormous, it's very thick, the groups being then sewn and bound together by the back. Well, this, unfortunately, with the traces we have now on the folios, is impossible to decide, and it's a technical enigma for me. The brown smear was apparently not found on the Tashkent copy, as Shebunin did not notice anything of this kind when he examined the manuscript. It would imply that the folios, which were separated from the rest, were rebound together in a rather crude way at some moment of the history. It would be interesting to have an analysis performed in order to identify the material which was used. We can suppose that it was some kind of glue which was introduced at some moment, probably during a restoration, in order to enhance the cohesion of the folios because the stitching at the back was too weak. Although this was probably running against the mechanics of the book, the weight of which tended to separate the folios even when the book was open at 45 degrees. You never open it flat, you open it like that, but even like that, this gluing would have been insufficient to hold it together. The manuscript in its original state was not only impressive for the two-dimensional size of the folios, but also for their number. On the basis of the text found on the folios here in Doha, and on the assumption that the density of the script did not deviate considerably from what can be observed, we can estimate that the copy contained about 1,000 folios, which amounted to a herd of 1,000 sheep, of course. In order to make further comparison with other manuscripts easier, this means that 362 square meters of trimmed parchment were required for the production of such a volume. Here I have, in order to make things intelligible, make this drawing where you see in green what is required to, let's say, a normal copy of the Quran. You need 2.5 square meters of parchment. The next in blue is a Hijazi copy of the middle of the 7th century. So it needs 18 square meters, and it's a fair copy. It's not bad. Then in orange, you have the quantity of parchment required for the famous Sana manuscripts, 124 square meters. And our manuscripts, of course, is in red, and you see that there is a kind of inflation in terms of consumption of parchment, which, of course, will be discussed a little bit later. The script of the Doha folios is rather homogeneous and suggests that the copyist was a professional. You cannot write these kind of things without a proper training. He could, of course, rely on a comparatively recent technical tradition of large scripts, exemplified by the famous Sana Quran, which I just mentioned, dated to the beginning of the 2nd, 8th century, where the use of a writing implement with a very broad nib can also be observed. The copyist, or better, the copists, because you cannot think that it was the work of a single man, were working in very difficult conditions due to the size of the folios, with the page certainly held slanting, maybe on some kind of board. This appears especially clearly when one examines the letters, the bottom of which looks darker due to the fact that the ink applied on the parchment drifts down before drying. You see that the upper part of the letters is clearer than the bottom, because the ink has been going down. On the other hand, the broad nib of the writing tool did not always allow the copyist to leave a regular stroke or achieve immediately a satisfactory shape. He had therefore to re-ink the text at some places, a process which in some cases may also have taken place at a later date. There are some restorations, some re-inking of the parchment, which may correspond to a later phase of the history of the manuscript. This is especially true of the recto sides, that is to say the flesh sides of the parchment sheets. The ink could not adhere quickly and seep through, so that the script looks quite faded and in many places had to be re-inked by a later hand. When Pisarev prepared the facsimile of the folios in St. Petersburg, he also had to re-ink the folios, which resulted in mistakes that raised a controversy in Muslim circles who were saying that the manuscript had been tampered with and the text was not the true text of the Quran. According to the rules of this moment of Islamic calligraphy, the text is evenly distributed on the folio without any distinction between the interword spaces and those eventually found within a single word. As a consequence, dividing a word at the end of a line is allowed, as you can see here, but the copyist would avoid, in any case, breaking a word between two pages. He will always keep the last word intact. The height of the script combines with the importance given to the horizontal component underlined by the elongation or mashq of the letter sod, ta, kaf, and of isolated or final ba, fa, and ya. The latter has actually 2 or 3 shapes, of which only one lends itself to elongation. In spite of its shape, quite close to that of the kaf, the dal is not elongated or only very little. It's underlined in blue. It will always remain short, let's say. Exceptionally, the horizontal tail of the final mim can also be extended at the end of a line when the copyist needs to fill in the space. Shebunin published a plate with a few spectacular examples of a single word occupying a full line. There is no such occurrence on the folios now in Doha, where in the most extreme cases we find 2 words on a line. It is to be noted, however, that it does not preclude the use by the copyist of dashes at the end of the lines in order to produce a more regular left-hand margin. In some cases, there is actually no room for any letter, and the device seems more a matter of aesthetics, but very often it may be quite long, which suggests that the copyist had not planned carefully his writing and the distribution on the text on the line. There seems to be no trace of any ruling, although it would have been difficult, if not impossible, to dispense with any system allowing to write horizontally and regularly. Well, I don't know if I comment the letters because it's rather boring, and I will show you the plates taken from Shebunin where you can see that there are some variations. The Doha folios come from the same place of the manuscript, so they are probably the work of a single hand. But the manuscript was produced by various copyists, and on the plates you may notice some variations in the shape, for example, of the look at the teeth of the scene, for example, or the final cough. There are 2 shapes, one with the tail going back and another one with a rather vertical design. The final cuff here is interesting because it has a lower line going very far as in the Umayyad tradition, but actually in most of the cases the final cuff is the short version. The same can be said about some letters like the mim. The mim is round at the beginning of a word but flat at the end. And you notice also that the initial or medial ha is straddling on the line, something which makes me conclude that it has some connection with my B family. I have my own crazes, and my typology of early Quranic script is one of them. I'm sorry for this. And so I use this very curious way of saying things that it belongs to this group in order to make things easier for myself. For the others, I don't know. So the script has some distant relationship with this group of script, the B1, but it's not exactly the same thing. It looks like, let's say, an adaptation of something else to a very unusual format. Of course, such manuscripts were not written every day, so the copyist had to figure out how to translate his own experience at writing in this kind of script to a gigantic format. Well, it would be interesting, of course, to go deeper into the study of the manuscript, but unfortunately, it's not the point here, and I will leave it for a later study. All the elements found on the Doha folios, which can be now subsumed under the heading illumination, are all found within the writing surface. We don't have opening pages in Tashkent, and nothing is left, so we cannot say anything about this. The verse separators can barely be considered as illumination, since they consist of a column of oblique strokes made with ink, probably by the copyist himself, as the ink seems quite close to that of the text. The groups of 5 verses are not singled out by a specific device, but the decades are indicated in a more conspicuous way with square ornaments containing a 4-pointed star with a circle in its center. A red letter, or 2 when the number is higher than 100, is written there on the white background of the parchment and indicate the tense according to the abjad value of the letters. The manuscript follows the old abjad sequence, in which Sod is the equivalent of 60. The information is not present on the Doha folios, as the only place where it could have been found on folio 7a, where the ornament has been teared away, so we cannot say. But Shebunin's illustrations compensate this loss and provide a fair number of examples. The decayed ornaments use mainly green and red, but the 2 loops connecting the branches of the star are in blue. The same device is also found at the end of Surah 21 and 22, where the total number of verses of the Surah is indicated at the end of the Surah. On folio 3a, 14b, 15b, and 20b, the decayed ornaments have been totally or partly torn away. They were probably the target of people looking for memorabilia or ingredients for an amulet. The same thing happened to the headband between Surah 21 and 22 on folio 5a. Only the vignette located in the outer margin remained on the manuscript. Although there are only 11 lines on the page in that case, so we see the change from one surah to another. Although there are only lines on that page, there is only a very narrow band of illumination, because the letters, the final nun of the last word of Surah 21, Tasifun, the nun is going down in such a way that it prevented any utilization of the space to the right. We are fortunate enough to have a second surah ornament on folio 10b, on the last line of the page. Well, here again, I suppose someone decided to tear away the outer vignette of the headband, but he left at least part of it. We can have thus a very precise idea of the way in which it looked like. The composition relies on a simple pattern which the illuminator or illuminators of the Tashkent copy used extensively, as we'll see in a minute. It is based on the repetition of a module, rectangular or preferably square, which is repeated mechanically side by side on the horizontal. Here it's a network of lines in reserve organized around a central cycle which delimitates colored areas in red, blue, and green. As in the case of the decade ornaments, no gold has been used. The blossom vignette in the left part of the folio, in the inner margin, testifies that the illumination was produced at a time where vignettes were found at both extremities of the headbands. I prefer vignette than ansa because ansa is connected, as you know, with epigraphy. The idea at the origin of this use was precisely that everybody thought that since the beginning the headbands had the title and number of verses of the surah. Actually, it's not the case, and the earliest surah dividers are without any indication at all. So I prefer vignette for this kind of things. The place of the headband found between Surah 22 and 23, as well as the mention of the total number of verses of the preceding surah in the red circle. So it's not 10 verses, it's the number, the final number of verses in the surah, suggests that this was meant as a closing piece and not as an opening piece of the next surah. It's also something which is familiar with old Quranic manuscript, that you have the title at the end of the surah and not at the beginning, as is now the rule. In addition, the folio exhibits an interesting feature. The space left blank after the last word of Surah 22 has been filled by a decorative device in the shape of an arrow. On the basis of the information, and this is not something unusual because we have other examples, let's say between the 2nd and the 3rd centuries of this kind of decoration, which disappears later completely. On the basis of the information provided by Shibunin, we can see that the Tashkent volume relied heavily on this kind of decorative device, that is to say that of a module repeated side by side in order to separate one surah from the next one. The space usually left by the copies for the decades and the surah implies some coordination with the illuminator if both text and illumination were not the work of the same person. On the other hand, the case of the headband between Surah 21 and 22, with this noon which occupies the place of the illumination, suggests that the copyist did not always care for the work of his colleague or what was to happen later. It's not an isolated case, and Shibunin reproduced in his plays a few cases of such awkward situation for the illumination. I should also mention here that in addition to the script and the illumination of the manuscript, the orthography has been submitted to two studies. The first one by Shibunin, who was the first one to look at it closely. And later it was again analyzed by Arthur Jeffrey and Isaac Mendelssohn, who, working on the basis of the Pissarreff facsimile, made an extensive study of the orthography. They reached the conclusion that it could be dated to the 3rd or 9th century on the basis of the orthography. Well, actually, I'm not completely confident with this because there are some very archaic features which survived. And although it reflects a very more developed state of the Quranic orthography than the Codex Parisino-Petropolitanus, which I love very much, we have, like this old way of writing bi'ayatine with an extra denticle which corresponds to a ya which is working for the long a in aya, which is left. Then it disappears completely. But it's possible that the copists were working with an older copy and didn't care to upgrade, let's say, the orthography of the codex and change this. So I recalled at the beginning of this presentation the data referred, the data related to the age of the manuscript. Shebunin hypothesis, the Geoffrey Mendelssohn suggestion of a date to the 9th century, and then the C14 dating. So the two, I mean, well, they are not conflicting, but let's say the range is larger in the second case. Now we have to turn to the evidence of other manuscripts which can be related to this copy in order to understand what is date and what it means. Large copies were by no means uncommon at an early date. In addition to a spurious saying attributed to Caliph Omar, who expressed his dislike of small copies, extant evidence points to an early tradition of such huge Quranic manuscripts. A now famous example is the recently found Umayyad fragment Sana Dar al-Martutat 2033-1. The format is vertical in this case, and the 45 by 36.5 centimeter folios are slightly smaller than the Tashkent Doha ones, but Hans Caspar von Bothmer has argued that the original dimensions were not those, but 51 by 47 centimeters, which may imply that the manuscript was an in plano. A C14 dating of the parchment to the years 657 to 690 has been published, although a slightly later date during the reign of Al-Walid between 705 and 715 was favored by the author. The text has been transcribed with 20 lines to the page, and the vowels are indicated with a system of red dots. The script is clearly different from that of the Doha folios or the Tashkent part of the manuscript. The quality of the illumination surpasses that of the headbands we have seen, with far more sophisticated composition and a higher mastery of the design. The opening pages of Sana have no parallel, but, well, we cannot say anything because they just disappeared from the Tashkent Codex. In addition to the colors present on the Doha folios, also found in Sana, gold is consistently used in the latter fragment. A copy kept in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin suggests that the 20-line vertical format had some diffusion, and the script is in this case related to the former one. I shall only briefly mention the smaller and slightly earlier fragment Marcel 13 in vertical format, kept in St. Petersburg, as another example of Umayyad Quranic manuscripts. As in the Sana copy, the illumination is the work of very skilled artists, relying on a repertory borrowed from the late antiquity and using gold as well as red, blue, green, and yellow. And as you see, vowels are present. An unpublished copy of which a few folios have been seen on the market, and two of them are here in Doha, could be mentioned here. It is an in-folio codex measuring 50 by 43 centimeters. The text, transcribed in a variant of the C1 group of scripts with 20 lines to the page again, like the Sana copy, is consistently vocalized with a variant of the red dot system found in both the Sana and St. Petersburg fragments. The headbands reflect a variety of themes, among which many examples based on the repetition of a module like the Tashkent Doha one. As a rule, the illuminators seem less proficient than those who were in charge of the Sana or the Marcel 13 fragments, and they do not use gold. An unpublished C14 dating concluded to a 68% possibility of a date between 656 and 675, and a 95% possibility of a date between 648 and 691, although I would date this manuscript to the first half of the 8th century. A small group of 12 lines to the page copies of the Quran in oblong format offers a striking parallel to the Tashkent Doha manuscript. We meet first Cairo, Dar al-Kutub, 953 with 568 folios of 54 by 62 centimeters, very close to the Tashkent Doha one. Shebunin examined the manuscript and published in 1902 a study in the same journal where he had previously discussed the Tashkent copy. Only 248 folios may be original, the others belonging to various restorations, using either parchment or paper. Fragments from this codex are now found in Paris and Gotha. As the latter, the parchment sheets have been piled up in the same position, that is to say, with the flesh side as the recto of every single folio. Shebunin noted that the folios were not folded like those in Tashkent in order to produce stubs and then pairs of folio and then quires. But he said that they were glued together and then glued to the back, I don't know how, which confirms that the Doha folios reflect probably the original situation. The script is, however, different, as you can see, and belongs to the C group of early Quranic script. The short vowels are not indicated, and the ornaments between the surah, which draw from a larger repertory, do not use at all gold. Another copy of this group is kept in Cairo, also in Mashhad Hossein. It has been known for some time and is also attributed to Caliph Osman. Recently, a facsimile has been published. Unfortunately, the photos are the size of a stamp, so you cannot properly see that. And there is no codicological description of it. A date to the 7th century has been suggested, but I don't agree with it. The manuscript is interesting because it contains 1,087 folios, which would be rather close to the Doha Tashkent copy. It was refurbished, and unfortunately, we cannot decide which folios are original and which are later addition. Once again, it seems that gold is not used and vowels are absent. In addition to these two 12 copy to the page fragments, we have another manuscript with 55 lines to the page, which also seems to be related by its script to the first Cairo copy. It has been C14 dated to the years 644 and 675 for the lower possibility range, and 609 to 694 for the upper possibility. The folio are quite similar in size to the Tashkent and Cairo volumes, 50 centimeter by 54, but there are 25 lines to the page. The surah are separated from each other by a band of illumination, and as in the two Cairo and the Tashkent Doha folios, there is no title at all. There is no use of gold either, and no vowels on the text. But in all these cases, there is no direct evidence of the date, which leaves us with the task of dating the manuscript with the elements we have at hand. It's clearly different from the vertical Umayyad ones with 20 lines to the page. Some sources about this period may provide additional clues. A legal authority active in the second half of the 8th century, Malik ibn Anas, expressed about the Mus'haf opinions by which the 12 lines group of Quranic manuscript apparently abide. He conveyed his disapproval of the vowel signs on the reference Mus'haf called by him Ummahat al-Masahif, for example, and condemned the multi-volume copies of the Quran. He also disapproved illumination, according to a later commentator, either because it might distract the reader or because the use of gold is frowned upon by the Malikite school of law. It is actually surprising that copies which required such an enormous investment for the purchase of more than 1,000 sheets of parchment are so poorly illuminated without any gold. This avoidance could only be the result of a deliberate decision. The same can probably be said of the illuminators of the 4 manuscripts, who were by no means as proficient as those of the Sana or St. Petersburg fragments. These huge and extremely expensive copies can only be conceived as imperial presentation copies produced at a moment when rigorist views, like those expressed by Malik, had the upper hand, and the authorities needed to impress the Muslim community by an outstanding gift. Such a move could correspond to an account by Malik ibn Anas, transmitted by al-Samudi. According to this source, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mahdi ordered expensive copies of the Quran, which is sent to the major cities of the empire, imitating a similar measure taken a few decades earlier by al-Hajjaj, who was himself emulating Caliph Osman. In the Mosque of Medina, the Abbasid Codex superseded the Umayyad one, which was put in a chest next to the minbar. On the basis of these various elements, I would suggest a dating to the second half of the 8th century, perhaps to the reign of al-Mahdi, that is to say 775, 785. The question of the place where the manuscript is transcribed is left completely aside, and I don't think that the Basra connection should be taken. If big is beautiful, then this manuscript is undoubtedly beautiful. However, awe is certainly the word which best describes the impression left by this monumental copy. It is based on the very simple but effective idea of magnifying the Word of God. From the sheet to the volume, all the components were brought to a limit, actually, that of the hides used in the preparation of parchment. In the historical context of the beginning of Abbasid rule, if my suggestion is correct, these copies had the last word. We should not forget that they could also answer the need to give its full importance to the Quranic text vis-à-vis the other religions of the book. The technique was certainly the weak point of these manuscripts. Their size and weight, like this Dinosaurus, were needed a stronger composition or continuous repairs, and apparently they were repaired many times in order to keep them together, as is the case for the 2 Cairo copies. They were nevertheless quite effective, as your reaction when you saw this slide has shown. Thank you.